I've built a lot of computers for family and friends, but today I'm building one for me. Hey everybody, it's Chris from Family Geekery, and today we are going to be putting together a mini-ITX system that I've been wanting to build for a while and just haven't had the time. So I'm taking the time today to build this computer, and this is going to be a gaming computer for me, and it's going to be portable so that I can carry it from my office up to maybe the living room so we can do some couch co-op games, have some fun with the family. And I've had this case, this Lian Li TU150 mini-ITX case. It's a really sleek and sexy case with a little handle on it. Should be nice and portable once it's all done. And I've got some other parts here to throw in it. So we're going to be building up a computer today. So let's go through the parts list. So none of these parts are going to be top of the line, brand new, best of the best parts. I'm building this together on a budget because I've already got a really nice gaming computer in my office, but this one I want to be able to take around the house. And so I'm starting off with an ASRock B450 Gaming ITX AC, and that's going to be the motherboard. And we're going to put on there a Ryzen 7 3800X. So again, not the newest processor, but this system should be able to handle all of the games that I want to play, especially at 1080p. So I don't have any concerns about performance. We're going to throw in there also 16 gigs of DDR4 3600 megahertz RAM. I've got a NVMe drive here, a 2 terabyte drive, because once I put this thing together, I don't ever want to go back in there again. So I'm going to start off with 2 terabytes right on the board. Plus, I don't want to have any extra cables for SATA, SATA cables and power cables for the hard drive. This thing's going to be pretty tight inside. The wiring's going to be pretty tight. So having this just right on the main board is going to help out with that. Now, to get this in here, this type of case requires a SFX power supply. So I've got a 750 watt gold power supply for that. That should be plenty fine. And to keep the processor cool, I've got a Corsair H60. Now, I'm not going to be overclocking this chip at all, so I could have gotten away with just a little tower fan or something. But this case does support a 120 one fan 120 millimeter AIO, so I'm going to go ahead and try to fit that in there, and that's going to keep it plenty cool. And to finish out the parts list, of course, I need a GPU if I'm going to be doing any type of gaming. So a friend of mine had this card here, which is an MSI Aero, and it's a 2070. So 2070 8 gigabyte card, and it's nice and small, right? One little fan. So this should fit in there just fine and still allow for some airflow through the system. So we're going to do this card, which again, not top of the line, but should be plenty strong for the type of gaming I'm going to be doing. So what are we waiting for? Let's go ahead and get this thing together. Now normally I like to take the motherboard and populate all the parts in it and get it all powered up and test it all out. And I think that's what I'm going to start to do. So I'm going to take the motherboard out, put the CPU in, the RAM in, mount the SSD, and in between now and then I'll decide if I want to actually mount the AIO on it outside of the case or wait until I get it inside the case before I mount it. So I'm going to figure that out on the fly. Not quite sure which way I want to go with that first. So let's go ahead and start taking some of the stuff out of the wrappings and start populating this board. Alright, so we got the motherboard out, and it had a little protective little foam thing I'm going to keep down there. This is an anti-static mat, but I'm going to keep this down here, just you'll see why in a second. And one of the things on this board, when they have so much stuff that they need to put in a tiny little space, sometimes they get creative in where they put things. So on this particular board, the SSD actually plugs into the bottom. So this is another reason why I don't want to ever have to come back and change this thing out. So that's why I'm starting with 2 terabytes, because once this thing is mounted up against the back plane of the case, then it'd be very hard to get to it. So we're going to go ahead and mount this first. So I've got my SSD here. This is a Mushkin Pilot 2 terabyte. So let's go ahead and put that in. And of course the motherboard comes with a little tiny screw to do that. Now I don't usually use my Strebito screwdriver that I'm always showing in all my MacBook videos for building PCs, but for the SSD to hold this thing in here, the tiny little screw that holds that in there, this is a lifesaver for having that magnetic tip and the tiny little Phillips. So my normal screwdriver that I use for building PCs is just too big to grab that tiny little screw. So saved my life again. We'll put that to the side, and now we've got this mounted. So that's kind of why I wanted to have a little bit of cushion underneath here while we're doing the rest of it. So let's go ahead and get the processor out and get the RAM mounted. Alright, so let's get the processor mounted in there first. And we got all these tiny little pins, so you don't want to touch those, you don't want to accidentally bend them. So we're going to lift up the handle on the CPU, the little lever there on the CPU socket. We're going to find the corner that matches the arrow on here, so there'll be a squared off pin opening here, and these are kind of more triangular, so we're going to match that up against that and gently lay it in there. I usually give it just a little tiny wiggle just to see that it did get in there straight and not wobbly, and once we got that in there, we'll lock that down. Now as far as the cooler goes, I looked at the manual on the H60. The parts that came with it didn't match what the manual shows. I don't know why. But as far as I can tell, the parts that we're going to be using for mounting this water pump on top of here is going to use the stock AMD ears here. So we're going to go ahead and leave those on, so we can move on to the RAM next. So for the RAM, I went with this T-Force Vulcan Z. Like I said, it was 3600 megahertz. We got two 8 gig sticks. That should be fine. And to mount this in here, we're going to figure out which of these ears open. So these are stationary. Sometimes both the ears open. So on this particular motherboard, just these two ears open. We're going to find the offset notch here, match it up with the offset notch there, so you don't plug it in backwards. And then once we figure that out, we're just going to lay it in there gently flat first, and then I'm going to push one side, push the other side. And you hear a little crunch crunch. That's completely normal. Then we're going to line this up again. Alright, now once I get them both pushed down on there, I usually run my finger over to see if one is, like that, and that's an exaggeration, but if they're not completely parallel with each other, then you probably didn't seat one completely down. The other thing I look at is to make sure both of these ears have locked into the holder. So I think I'm good on both of those. So now we got the CPU, we got the RAM, we got the SSD, so the board is pretty much populated. Alright, so I think I figured out the mystery of the AIO mounting, and this H60, they've been making it so long that I think there's just a couple different versions of the manual, and they've changed the mounting brackets over the years, so I think I got the right ones on now. So these guys were on pre-mounted, and this is for Intel, and I just had to slide those out of this groove and put in these guys here for the AMD. And then once we've got that mounted down, we're going to have these little screws and little grabbers here are going to hold on to the built-in ears for the AMD brackets and then tighten it down. So we're going to go ahead and take a shot at that. It's already been pre-applied with thermal paste, so I'm good with that. So we're going to lay it down and get this mounting bracket in here. So we're going to get it close to the board here and get ready to mount it. Taking attention not to grab onto the thermal paste, so I'm keeping this little protective plastic thing on as long as I can. And one thing I wanted to note was I wasn't real psyched to see this on here. So this is a SATA powered cable, obviously, so it's going to get its power from here. And then this guy is a little 3-pin that would normally plug into your motherboard. If it was a full 4-pin, then it could get power and everything from it, but maybe it's pulling too much power that it didn't want to pull it from the board, so it's going to get all the power from the SATA connector, and this they're calling a TAT cable. So it is going to plug into the CPU fan header, and it's basically just going to find out from the motherboard how fast it needs to be going. So that's normally what would, this pin here is normally what would tell the fan how fast to spin. So it's going to tell the AIO pump how fast to pump the liquid through, I guess. So let's go ahead and get these mounting ears on. So these guys here, they just screw apart. We're going to put the little key looking thing underneath. And we're going to start off just by getting a couple threads threaded on each one. Then once we get it locked on there, we can tighten it down a little bit more. So let's get the second one on there. And you can see even on the tubes here, so this has been sitting on my shelf for a while. So you can see the discoloration on the tubes. All that is that's just the rubber devulcanizing. I'm just going to take some alcohol and run it across there. It's going to make it black again. So that's nothing to be concerned about. Rubber, all rubber does that. It eventually starts destroying itself, basically. So now we've got this set. Let's see if we can set it down and get it mounted up. Get this cable out of the way. Get a couple threads on the top one here. Lock down the second one. There we go. After all these years, this is still the best mount that they can think of, I guess, to include. But it gets the job done. So I'm just going to kind of tighten these down evenly. You don't want to torque them down so hard that it may put too much pressure on. So I'm just going to get them finger tight on both sides. And that feels pretty solid, so I'm happy with that. So the next step is, we've got a fan to mount on here, but I'm not exactly sure where this is going to mount inside the case yet. So I don't want to mount the fan on there yet. And then let's get it in the case. So here it is, the Lian Li TU150. And Lian Li makes really nice cases. Like I said, this one's been sitting around in my parts bin for a little bit. I've been waiting to build in it, so I'm pretty excited to get this thing finished. So they make a couple different models of these. They make a silver one and then a black one. They make it with the side window and without the side window. This particular one has the side window. Now I wasn't exactly looking to pimp this thing out, but it's nice to have the window. Kind of looks nice. So looking inside here, we've got our I/O cables from the front I/O. Looks like we got a USB-C, which is nice. Now this board, the motherboard that I have, isn't going to support that, but it's nice to have just in case. And we've got the reset and the power cables and a USB-C, and then the front audio. So if we look at the front I/O on the top here, power switch, USB-C, a couple USB 3s, microphone and headphone, and then this must be the reset switch. And here's the cute little handle on top here. Oh, that's nice. It must have like springs or magnets or something, because that is pretty sturdy. And then it locks back down. That's pretty neat. And then inside here, this is where we're going to put the PSU. It's actually side mounted instead of being on the back of the case. And some of these mini-ITX cases will take a full-size ATX PSU. This one said for sure right on the webpage, hey, it needs an SFX, so that's what we got for it. And by mounting on the side like that, it's going to use this right angle power adapter here, which is going to relocate the power input to the back of the case, which is nice. Keeps it nice and clean. So this supports 4 120mm fans, one on the back, 2 on the bottom, and then 1 on the front. We're going to be using one of those obviously for the the AIO. And then I'm not sure if I'm going to put the bottom ones here or not. You can draw air in from the bottom. It blows it kind of over your GPU, and then you can exhaust it out the back. So pretty nice. Let's get this thing opened up a little bit more. We can take the front off and take the back off, I think, and we're going to start mounting some stuff in there. Now this particular case is not cheap. I happened to get it on sale at my local micro center. But there's a reason why it's not cheap. This thing is so well built. The front, the back, the front, the top, the back, and the front glass, the side glass here, all just pulls off without any tools. No, there's no screws, no screwdriver needed. All just nice, firmly fit pins that plug in there. So everything is going to be a lot easier to get my hands into after all. And yes, there is a magnet up underneath here that mounts down to this little metal plate that actually has a rubber lining on it so that it doesn't slam shut too loud. And we're going to have a whole tray up here for cable routing. And then on the back side, there is some room back here for cable routing also. Now there's a couple places in the back and on the bottom that you can mount drives. So if you wanted to mount some actual SATA drives, you could. I'm going to try to avoid mounting any drives just to keep it simple. But let's start putting some things in this. Alright, now just to kind of test fit the board down here. It's not screwed down yet. But just seeing where it's going to sit, it looks like the radiator for this particular AIO is not going to fit here just because of where the shelf is for the power supply. It's just not going to line up. It didn't fit up and down. It didn't fit sideways. So it looks like it's going to have to be here. So looking at the website at how they've mounted it, they've got it mounted here with a fan on the inside pushing the air out. Now that means whatever the temperature of the air is inside the case is going to be going over the radiator, which isn't ideal, but I'm going to guess without the processor generating any heat inside the case, with just the GPU generating heat, then hopefully with the airflow coming in the front, it'll at least be a lower temperature coming across the radiator than the liquid inside here. So it shouldn't have any problem cooling. Like I said, I'm not going to be overclocking, so we'll just look at the temps once we get it all set up. If we had to add some more fans coming in, then I'll do that down the road. Alright, I'm back with another little change of plan. After looking again at the instructions for the AIO, despite what the pictures show, it says, note, we suggest you use this as an intake on the back of the case. So that means we're going to be mounting this fan to pull air through. So this is going to be, the radiator is going to be mounted to the back. This is going to be mounted here. We're going to be pulling air, clean air in through here and then blowing it out the front. So we'll put another fan up here to push air out. Now, I don't know, I don't think I can move this filter. Ideally the filter would be on the intake and not on the outtake. But we're going to see what we can do to get this mounted up. So it's got a couple long screws here to mount through the fan into the radiator, and then a couple short screws here to mount through the case into the radiator, and that's going to hold it all together. So let me get a couple things in position here, and I'll be right back. Alright, so one thing I like to do before I mount the motherboard is to figure out which of the million screws that they include with the case is going to be the right ones to mount the motherboard standoffs. Now in this case the standoffs were already mounted to the board, mounted to the case, since there's only one way really you can do it, since it's the mini-itx. So I'm going to guess that this is the right screw here, so I like to just put it in, go backwards a little bit until you get that first click, and then screw it down and make sure this is the right thread size, the right depth, and make sure it doesn't cross thread or anything. A lot easier to do before you put the board down there than after you put the board down there and start getting half of the screws in and find out that they're not the right size, they're cross threading. So now that I know what size it is, I'm going to go ahead and place the board down, and I'm going to mount those 4 screws in. Alright, so I got the motherboard mounted down to the back plane there, and a couple hints on that. Of course, first thing you want to do is make sure you don't forget to mount the I/O plate on first. So you want to make sure you put the I/O plate into the case first before you mount the motherboard down. Of course, we've all done that and forgotten that, and that's a real pain in the butt. So once you get the I/O plate in there, make sure it's all pushed in equal on each corner so that's nice and flush. Then you're going to bring the motherboard in, and what I usually do is I bring it in at an angle like this, making sure that I'm not raking anything on the bottom, all the contacts on the bottom, not raking that up against any metal. Push it down at an angle, get all the ports to line up, and then see if the 2 screw holes on the left side of the board line up, and then lay the board down flat and make sure that the 2 screw holes on the right side line up. So you want to kind of put it in an angle, get all these ports to line up. And another tip is make sure once you do line that up, before you screw the thing down, make sure there's little metal ears behind each one of these ports. Make sure that none of those ears have folded down and are sticking in front, especially the LAN connector here. That's one that will always kind of fold out and be in the way. That's just a pain in the butt. So make sure all of those ports you'll be able to get your cable in and out of without having one of those little metal brackets sticking in the way. So that's all done. The next step is mounting up the radiator. Alright, so I mounted the fan onto the radiator using those longer screws. It goes through both of the ears of the fan and right into the radiator. Make sure when you do that you don't over tighten these screws, because if you strip out the screw hole on the radiator, that's a bad day. But I did that. I did take some just regular rubbing alcohol and some toilet paper, and I ran it over, scrubbed the lines here, the rubber lines here a little bit. It cleaned it up a little bit. It's not perfect, but it's fine. And when I mounted this on here, I paid attention to the orientation of this cord so that once it's mounted in there, it's on the bottom corner. And that way there's some feed-through lines there. I'll be able to feed this cable right into the back there and pop it out another hole and get to one of the chassis fan connectors on the motherboard. And then the other thing, I didn't test out the fan first to see which way the airflow was. Sometimes there's an arrow pointing on the side. I'm going to guess that this is just like all the other fans where this brace here, this cross brace, is the direction of flow. So if I get that backwards, then I'm just have to take it off, flip it around, and put it back on. But hopefully it's correct. So again, we're going to mount it this way. It's going to be pulling air through the radiator, pulling in fresh air from the outside through the radiator, and then out the front. So let's go ahead and get this mounted into the case. I'll be right back. Alright, so I got the whole radiator and fan and everything mounted to the case. I did take that one cable and poke it through this hole back here, and it'll be able to come back in one of these other holes and plug into, I think there's a chassis connector fan over here somewhere. And then I've got the cable here, the power cable for the AIO pump. And like I said, it has the little tack cable here, and then it has the SATA power cable. And it allows you to separate the two. So I'm going to peel this back a little bit, just pulling slowly. That way I can put the SATA cable all the way in the back and hook it up behind there somewhere or up above so that it's out of the way, and then just this part of it is going to be plugged into the motherboard. Alright, so I'm going to go find a fan and mount a fan for the front, and this is going to be a front exhaust, and I'll be right back. Alright, so I got another fan mounted up here, and I've got that cable poking out the back here along with all the other front I/O cables. I just stash them out the back, and then after we get the power supply mounted in, I'll cable route them around there to come up to the motherboard. I did plug in both the front fan for the radiator to the chassis connector, and then I plugged in that tack cable for this pump right onto the CPU fan. So I got that taken care of. I've got this guy ready to go, so next thing we're going to do is grab the PSU, and we're going to mount the PSU up here, and then I'll start cable routing some of the other cables behind it. Alright, so I've got the SFX power supply mounted in here with the 4 screws. It was a little hard to get to this one, but you just move these cables out of the way, you get your screwdriver in there. Make sure when you do this, you've got a fan you might have a fan on one side of your power supply. Put the fan on the lower part, not on the upper part, otherwise it's going to be sandwiched right up against this top part, and that's not good. So we got the fan facing down. I've got this kind of routed around here. Just based upon the orientation of your plug, it may be different, but by plugging this in, it is kind of tight, and I did be able to make this bend here to keep it flush, otherwise it's going to be poking out the back. And then make sure you turn this on. At least on this unit, you can still reach this by taking that back cover off pretty easily. You know, no tools, you just pop the back or the side cover off, you can still get to that. I've done some of these ITX builds where when you put this in, you can't ever get to this and this again without taking the thing completely out. So this one, I like that. And looking at the other side of the power supply, this is fully modular, so we can put in only the cables that we need to. In this case, we've got the 24 pin for the motherboard, we've got the 8 pin for the CPU, we've got the 8 pin plus 8 pin for the GPU, and then I do have this SATA chain on here. Not that I have any SATA drives, but I do have that power supply or power cable for the AIO pump. So I'm going to try to route this up to the top here where I've got that cable already poked through. So that's going to be tucked away up top here. Alright, so like I said, I just poked the SATA cable up through, there's an opening right here. And then I connected the SATA from the AIO pump, and then did some quick little cable ties here just to keep this all in place, and a little cable tie here. I've got this cable attached here so it doesn't flip around, and then this is the other side of the fan cable, just the spare cable left from the fan cable. I tucked that up there and tied it down. So that's good enough for now. Let's start making some other connections to the motherboard before we get the GPU in there, because once we get that GPU in there, it's going to be hard to get to any of the small little connectors on the motherboard. So let's start connecting some things up. Alright, so let me show you what I got so far for the cable management. And it hasn't been as bad as what I thought with something this small. Let me show you what I got back here, and then I'll show you how they connect in the front. So probably the hardest one, or the most awkward one, is this USB 3 cable. Just because it's so fat and it's rigid. And the connector on the motherboard is probably one of the worst designs I've seen. I wish they'd change that connector. So I just tacked it down here with a tie wrap just to give it some strain release. We'll see on the front what it looks like. We've got the cable coming all the way down here and underneath, which is the HD audio cable, because your audio header is usually up towards the front of the motherboard where the connections are for audio. So I've got that down there. This one right here coiled up is just that USB-C, which we're not going to use. And then everything tied down here is the little cables for the reset switch, power switch, and there was a fan from the front. So the front fan is tied in there too. So all this is good to go. It doesn't look too horrible. So let's flip it around. And you've got the HD audio cable coming in here, and that's going to be kind of tucked behind the GPU once we get it in there. We've got the front I/O headers down here for the power switch and the reset switch, so those are easy to get to. Here's that USB 3 cable, and I feel pretty good that it's not going to pop out, so that's good to go. And then the weird one here was this fan connector. The header is right here, just to the left of the two RAM slots. So I had the choice of either going up and around or going down and underneath. And that was just way too close for the retaining clip of the GPU. So I just chose to go just straight up and over the RAM chips. Again, this isn't going to be a fancy display piece or anything. So if I need to get to that RAM, I can still get to it. I can pop that cable out, get to the RAM, pop the cable back in. I'm not too concerned about that. So that was the best solution I had for this. Now as far as the cables coming from the PSU, luckily the 24 pin cable was kind of short, so it just goes straight off of there, straight down to the board. That was easy. the CPU cable, if you're watching this video and you haven't put this together yet, plug that cable in before you put this monstrosity up here, because the header for it is usually back here, top left corner of your motherboard, and it's right behind this fan. And it wasn't impossible to get to, but it wasn't fun to get to either. So I got that. Same thing with the HD audio. And in this case, it's mostly because if you see this silver thing right here, that's my Wi-Fi antennas. It's just the header for this particular motherboard is right up next to that. And it's just a little hard to get to. But I got the cables in there, so they're good to go. And I think we're ready now just to pop the GPU in, give it some power, and I think we're ready to boot. Alright, so I placed the GPU in there, and it did kind of pinch that audio cable down. It pinched it underneath the card itself, but it's not bad. I'm not concerned about it at all. So that's taken care of. I plugged in the power cable coming from the PSU. One of the downsides of having the PSU come in mounting this way with all the cables is you just no sexy way to cable manage them. So I didn't worry too much about trying to route it anywhere. I just cleaned it up, and it's just going to be kind of floating there in the middle. Like I said, we got the window on the side here, but it's not going to be a pimped out, RGB, disco ball looking thing anyways. So if there's some black cables in there, so be it. I'm not too concerned about that. So with everything plugged in, all the wires tidied up, I think we're ready to plug a mouse and keyboard and monitor into it and see if we get to the BIOS. Alright, so before I close the case all up, I just want to give it a power and see if we can get into BIOS. So I got my cheap little monitor here, just a cheap mouse and keyboard plugged in. Got the mouse plugged in right up front here just to test the front I/O, and the keyboard's plugged into the back. So let's hit this power button and see what happens. Oh, we got noise, we got light. Help if I hit the power button on the monitor. Alright, here we go. Hit F2 or delete for BIOS. And look at that. So we got the AMD Ryzen 7 3800X. It's showing both DDR4s showing up, so that's good. So at this point, we are halfway there. We got BIOS, which is obviously the first important part. See what we're sitting at for the CPU temperature. Now this is not under load, of course, and it's showing 41.5 degrees Celsius. These AMD chips do run a little warm, especially the Ryzen 7, so I'm not too concerned about that, and looks good. So next step is to load some Windows on there. So I'm going to go grab my Windows boot disk and load some Windows up on it, and maybe close the case up, make it a little bit prettier. And before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and show you the inside while it's running. So there she is, just a little simple white LED action on the Corsair pump there, and a little white on the LED on the front fan. Not that you're going to see that from the front because it's solid aluminum front, but you will be able to see that through the window. So let's go ahead and grab Windows and throw it on here. Alright, so we got booted up to the Windows installed disk that I got on a USB drive, and I'm going to skip through this part because I've got a step-by-step video on how to install Windows like this. I'll link it down in the description below. So I'm going to go ahead and go through all this, get it into Windows and get the updates done, and then we'll come back to look at everything. Alright, so here it is with Windows all installed, and I got all the updates done, so let's go ahead and take a look at the hardware. So there's our Ryzen 7 3800X, 8-core 16 processes, and here's the 16 gigs of RAM. Now I haven't set up the XMP profile, overclocking the RAM and the BIOS yet, so it's still showing 2400, so I usually let this run for a day or two to make sure everything works good, and then I go ahead and enable that XMP and test it out some more. So I'll go ahead and do that to bring that up to 3200. Here's our 2 terabyte SSD and the RTX 2070. So everything is running smooth, all the updates went good. So let's go ahead and look at the final product with everything boxed up. Alright, so here it is. All closed up, all finished. And I didn't notice this before, and this is going to be hard to kind of see on camera, but on the tempered glass right here, there is a blacked out portion, and like I said, you can't see it on the camera, but it blacks out the area behind it, which is where all the cables coming out of that PSU are. So I guess they knew that those cables would be the ugliest part, so they blacked that out, which is nice. And this thing, it's got vent over here for the PSU. Plenty of airflow through here. This is not flush up against that fan. It tapers out a little bit so that you have plenty of room for air to come in here or blow out here in our case. So I do feel that when it's running, I do feel the air exhausting out here, so it must be drawing enough in there. I'll keep an eye on the temps, and if it needs a little bit more airflow, then I'll put some fans in the bottom down here and have them blowing up right up over all the components. But overall, I'm really happy with this case. There's a reason why it costs so much. There's a reason why it's not a cheap case, and that's because it's just built so well. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. Every piece of it is just quality. So I'm very happy. So taking a look at the back turned out just as clean too. And everything, like I said, is all toolless, so I can get in here and change anything I need to pretty easily. But I think I'm going to be set pretty nicely with this for now. I'm going to throw some games on it, going to test it out, give it a spin with the family, and I think we got a winner here. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hope you enjoyed watching me build this little mini-ITX gaming monster, and I'm going to have some fun with it. If you like this video, go ahead and give me that thumbs up. If you like this type of content, then go ahead and subscribe. I'm going to be doing some more PC stuff in the near future, so keep your eye out for it. I got some upgrades to do, and I got some builds to do. I got lots of parts. So stay tuned to the channel, and thanks for watching. Until next time, peace out and geek out.